All right, the first two things we have to do is get down to our oil cooler. So we need to remove the top parts of the engine and the intake plenum. This is the same exact procedure that you use to get to the spark plugs on the front bank of cylinders on this. I've got a link to the video in the description of that whole procedure, how to replace spark plugs on your 3.6 liter Pentastar. I'm gonna refer to that for this time. Otherwise this video is gonna get extremely long. The other thing we have to do is draw down the coolant below this top level of the engine. So you gotta basically drain as much coolant out as you can. Good time to replace that coolant if you need to anyway. So let's get at it. So we've removed the intake plenum. We're down to the intake manifold. That's here. And these are the fuel rails that feed the injectors, and they're held on by these bolts here. So we got to remove those. Take our fuel rails off. Put them to the side so we can get at the intake. So these are T30 Torx to get at these, and it's a good thing if it's been a while since you ran the vehicle. That will allow the gas pressure on this side of the pump to bleed down. Now we're dealing with a conventional multi-port fuel injection system here, not direct injection, so the pressures are much less, but be aware there still could be gas pressure on these rails. So we've got our feed line here. The good news is it's pretty flexible. So I'm going to take the back one off and see if we can just set this assembly kind of off to the side without having to disconnect that and disturb it too much. So each injector has a nice one of these blue O-rings. We want to make sure we don't lose those. And it's probably a good idea to get a new one of those. These look in pretty good condition. But some of them stick in the rail, some of them stick on the injector themselves. So we just got to make sure you've got all 6 of those, or go buy new ones. Now we can set our rails off to the side there. I did have one that's stuck on an ejector here. And that's the way we'll use them when we install it. We'll put them on the injector and then press the rail down. I'm finding it a little bit easier to remove the injector versus removing the wire off of it. The space you've got to work with is a bit challenging. So these push into place with a large O-ring, just like the top. So I'm finding it the easiest to basically just gently pry up on it and keeping a constant force, and it'll just pop right out of place. Don't do anything rough, but just kind of a consistent pressure on it, and it'll just pop right out of place. Of course, we don't want to get these significantly dirty or anything like that, so before we put them back in, we'll spray them off with some cleaner. Try to keep this as clean as environment as possible while we take those out. Now would be a great time to replace those fuel injectors if that's something you felt like was holding you back, or you had rough running conditions that weren't solved with spark plugs. Yeah, now's the time to do that. The biggest thing to keep clean is the inlet, so the top of that. You don't want anything to drop in that fuel injector where the fuel goes in. If you get dirt in there, it's going to clog up the fuel injector and it's going to be terrible. So that's something to consider. Now that we've got those out of the way, it's time to remove our intake manifold. So these are interesting. They're tiny T20 Torx. It's like the bit that you use to put screws in. Here's the moment of truth, to get a visual on our oil cooler. Oh, one more wire anchor. We also have a wire connection down here we have to separate. See, that's connected with our manifold. Here is our moment of truth. And as I suspected, we caught it very early. And we caught it very early, but there is definitely, it's leaking. We can see down below our sensing units there is a puddle of evaporated coolant. And on this side is the oil that we saw. So we're leaking oil from this end, and somewhere under here is a small coolant leak. We'll see better what's in the value of the engine after we take it apart, but it's definitely down there. We can see it's all wet right below here, and that would make sense. It's hot in here, top of the engine, bakes off, the smell comes out the end. So before we remove this assembly, there's coolant passing through it. The coolant level is way up here in our system. So I've got another video how to change your coolant in the Pacifica. Go to that video, link in the description, to drain your coolant out. Again, trying to make this video not be ridiculously long. Go to there. Once you're done with that, we're going to remove the oil filter, the existing oil filter, take the vacuum off that system, let the oil drain down into the pan fully. So that's out of here also. Oil circulates through here, obviously. So we got to do those two things, then we can pull it out. So another reason you might have to replace this assembly is this oil filter itself, and specifically the cap here gets torqued into that plastic assembly. It is not meant, and I use the word torqued lightly, it's not meant to be tightened down tight. You're relying on an O-ring seal, so basically you just snug it up so it doesn't rattle loose once you get that O-ring engaged. If you do torque it, a couple things can happen. You can crack the assembly and you'll leak oil, and you have to replace this whole thing just like we're doing today. Or the cap gets stuck. Believe it or not, these two things kind of gall together and you won't be able to get this loose. And you could strip the nut on top, so you really kind of SOL at that point. You need to do this and replace the assembly so you can get at your oil filter and replace that. Now I've got to drain the coolant, and then we'll get this thing out. Well, things are getting a little worse for the dealer. I straightened out some already before I decided to video this. They took this underbody panel off to do a diagnostic. They beat the heck out of our heat shield and crunched it up in the front. If you don't tuck it in nicely when you reinstall it, it gets all jammed up, so they tore it all up here. This was nice and sitting flat the last time I put it on. I know for sure I take the time. The other thing is the oil door is missing, so there's a little door there for the oil change so you can get at the drain plug on the oil pan. I make sure to put it back, tighten it up nice. They just must have thrown it out. The other thing is here that I notice is here that the last time was not, is an oil leak. So there's oil down here, and I wonder if it's coming down from the top of the engine where we've got the oil leak up by the oil cooler, but they did not say anything about that. Hey, you've got an oil leak. Didn't even mention it, because I don't think they want to cover it under warranty. So, I mean, this is just, for me, this is just getting obnoxious to this point. And the reason why I do all the stuff by myself. But let's carry on. Let's get our oil filter, oil cooler assembly out. We need to take out these reverse Torx or fasteners here, the hold downs. Once this is free, then we'll disconnect our sensors and our coolant line. But I want to leave those connected so there's not any spilling. We can see what is under this thing exactly. All right, this cooler filter assembly does have ports on the underside, so it is going to leak no matter what we do. But if we inspect before, this wiring here is all wet. There's kind of dried up puddles under there. There's a puddle in that little recess, and we also have oil way over here, kind of below the PCV valve. So I'll replace that too before we put this back together. But I think that's where my oil leak below is coming from. It's coming from up here somewhere and making its way down the side of the transmission. Anyway, this thing, look at the oil over here. This thing was definitely leaking into the valley. I don't see major signs of coolant, but definitely a lot of oil, and then it is wet over here. So I think I caught it quite early, but it definitely needs to be replaced. Okay, we've got our piece out. There are no obvious signs of cracks or anything in it. It does look like there's something going on with these plugs at the oil filter end. So oil is leaking out of there, or it could be this seal where it goes into the engine. The other seals look, yeah, okay, except for this oil seal looks a bit compressed and not like it was working well on this end. Temperature sensor and the coolant line, no obvious signs on there. Like I said, no obvious signs of cracking or anything on the assembly. All right, so if we look underneath, there is a decent puddle of oil now because that assembly holds oil. And then we can see signs of some of that seal ripping off on these are coolant passages. Here's the oil passage. So some leaking there, but overall hard to tell at this point, but we definitely had those puddles before we took it apart, so we know we had an issue there. This one over here, I'm not as sure about. We'll have to look into that, but we'll get this all cleaned up. The other thing you notice, around the intake ports, there was oil, an oil film here. That means oil's getting into our intake air. And there's only a couple ways that can happen is PCV valve blow by the engine. We're pressurizing the crankcase, and the positive crankcase ventilation is sucking that air out along with oil and dumping it into our intake piece. So that's definitely another sign pointing we need to replace the PCV valve, or we've got excessive blow by. PCV valve, that's pretty easy fix. Blow by, that's sort of the engine is wearing out. The piston rings are letting a lot of combustion pressure into the crankcase, so that is not a good thing. And it's not something that would be warranted either, because it's just kind of wear and tear, unless the engine catastrophically fails, which is not likely to happen. But let's get all this cleaned up in here so we can reinstall the new one. All right, I've got things fairly well cleaned up in here. It's hard to get access to it, but we can see there's a lot of evidence of leaks over time. Basically that dirt and sludge that's left on the bottom is what, after the oil or coolant evaporated, that's kind of the solids that are left in there. And it looks like it's been doing it for some time, not extremely bad, but definitely something that's been happening. All right, we're finally ready to put our new assembly in. So I was just kind of looking over some differences. These seals are interesting at the bottom. They basically crush and collapse. If we look at the ones on our existing piece, they're fully compressed. Hard to know, is that what the problem was? The seals went bad after time. Obviously, you know, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts in this thing. If our plastic piece warps a little bit, or, you know, we don't have nice even pressure down on all these seals from these bolts, that's likely why it was leaking. Where the aluminum assembly is a lot more stable and will likely have better even compression on these over time. So I think that's the big difference with the aluminum housing. Also less susceptible to cracking when we replace our oil filter. These are nice, stand nice and proud. I'm not going to touch these, lubricate them a little bit before we install it. Of course, this is our oil fill. That's not pressurized, so that just has a kind of an O-ring seal on it. Slides down in the into a fit, a cylindrical fit. The other thing on this side, where we've got these ports, I believe those are to allow machining. Maybe different orientations have something coming on this side. Our existing one has plugs in those too, but it looks like those plugs were leaking. There's some heat distortion in that on the plug, and there was oil around in that side. These are nice threaded steel plugs. You can see they use sealant on the threads when they put them in there versus these. So this is a big upgrade as far as that goes too. Forgot to mention this thing comes with a set of new bolts and some O-rings on them already, and some instructions of how to torque, what torque and what sequence to torque our new bolts down to make sure we get nice even pressure on those seals. We don't cock it down one way. All right, after swearing at it for a bit, I changed out the oil pressure sending unit. The tabs, the locking tabs for the connector weren't right on the aftermarket piece. So I just swapped over my old one to this. Took quite a bit to get that O-ring for the fill tube down in there. Little taps with the rubber mallet did the trick though. Okay, we're gonna take this down real slowly. I know it says to just, there's a torque sequence, but I'm just gonna give it kind of progressively here, the sequence it recommends, and come back and do it a bunch of times. Try to compress those seals as evenly as possible. All right, it's time to put our intake manifold back on. The kit did come with new gaskets, so I'm gonna pop these out and clean up some of this oil in the intake runners and everything, and we'll get that on. The other thing I'm going to do while we have it out, so the dirt comes this way, is just clean out our fuel injector spaces. Okay, we've got the intake manifold tightened down, we've got our new gaskets in. Now we've got to pop our injectors back in and put the fuel rails back down. Tighten those down. So what you want to do for the injectors is take out your O-ring, clean it up, then put it, or get new ones, then slide it onto the injector tip. Then once it's on the injector, you can apply a little bit of force and it'll pop down into the intake. And we just have to repeat for the rest of them. Now we want to take the blue O-rings that are the injector to the fuel rail seal and put them on the top of our injectors. Also recommend new ones here. Now it's time to put our fuel rails back. And that's just a matter of lining up our 3 injectors with our rail. Then we can put our screws back in. It's time to bring our plenum back in. Just wipe down the gasket surface is good. I was just gonna put a new oil filter in there before I forgot, but there was already one in there, so I'm gonna put it back. Looks like decent quality. So there's an extra one in the box and one already installed. That's actually kind of nice of them. All right, it's all back together. Let's see if it starts and it doesn't leak everything's all over. Fingers crossed. She runs like a champ. Just had to cycle the ignition to the on position a few times without starting it to prime the fuel system and get gas up to the injectors. Otherwise, we're good to go, so I'm gonna fill it up with coolant, and this job is done. I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of a pain in the butt. It's been about a week and a half since changing out the oil filter cooler assembly, and the smell of burning coolant, evaporating coolant, is completely gone. I have not taken it to the dealer yet to do their warranty replacement of the water pump. I wanted to do this first, prove to myself and to you that the water pump was not the problem. I think I'm gonna still do that, get a new water pump under warranty. I already paid that stinking deductible. Get another round of fresh coolant in, I guess, and take it from there. But I do have some big news coming on this vehicle. It's been pretty reliable, but the maintenance and kind of stuff are just adding up to the point where I'm not so sure I want to deal with it anymore. Let me know down in the comments below when you reach that point when you're finally just done with something. Thanks for watching. Adios.